I'd like to move straight to Katherine, because, of course, I know partly you'll be speaking from your own point of view and partly from that of Christian Aid, but Christian Aid was an organisation, Kazi, that you mentioned, which is very engaged in partnership models and in issues around national capacities. So it'd be very interesting to hear your point of view.
Thank you, and thanks to Paul and to Kim for this really interesting and timely, I think, report that kind of builds on, I think, a lot of the emerging discussions and debate about the role and importance of local and national actors in humanitarian response. I just want to check that the sound is coming through all right, because I know I was given specific directions about the mic, so good. Yes, I'm going to be talking a bit, I suppose, in relation to some research that Christian Aid did last year for a report called Building the Future of Humanitarian Aid, and looked specifically at kind of the role of local and national actors and the partnership approach, taken from Christian Aid's own experience of using that model for disaster risk reduction and response. I think the key kind of areas for action that came out of that report that speak here are around the importance of a change in practice, a change in global perspective, and a change in funding, coordination and attitude to enable and facilitate the kind of partnerships and collaborative relationships that can lead for, can go forward for the kind of sort of future of humanitarian aid that we're looking for, and for the role of local and national actors. And what do I mean by that? Well, a change in practice. We look for humanitarian agencies to develop better practice across the sector on collaborative partnership approaches for disaster prevention and response. In terms of change in global perspective, we look for the importance of DRR and emergency response to be better built into resilience and development work. And in terms of change in funding, coordination and attitude, we call on donors, UN coordination mechanisms, national governments, and others to fund, coordinate and deliver emergency responses as if local capacity mattered. And I just wanted to frame those because I think they really bring a perspective to what I want to say about this report. I think what's interesting about the role of networks is that it takes partnerships that are understood perhaps in an old-fashioned way around as a bilateral thing, and they actually show and reveal the much more complex set of ecosystems at work in terms of relationships. So I know of no organisation that is the member of only one network. Most organisations, if they're a member of a network, they're a member of several formal and informal networks designed to facilitate and support different aims and objectives. And I think there's a lot to be learned, and we can see that here in terms of what that delivers. How can networks, questions that Kim posed for us were about how networks can focused on national actors can improve the connectedness and coordination of response. And I think one of the strongest ones that's come out here, and that builds on some of the stuff that came out in our report, is around building trust, building and sharing skills, and building the kind of collaborative relationships and ecosystems that aid the very difficult, tense kind of response time. I was thinking particularly around how do networks strengthen and enable their members to respond to extensive risk versus intensive risk. And I've been thinking a bit about what that looks like in terms of providing this scale up and surge capacity. One of the biggest sort of challenges to the partnership model and the working with local and national actors is around how to scale up and how to surge in a way that really supports locally led response and meets the need. And I think networks and the ability of networks to support their members to share information, to do some of the sort of 6 areas that were described, can and does have a very strong role in providing elements of surge capacity. And I think I'd be interested in exploring further what would it mean to surge through and through the network systems in terms of surging accompaniment, surging skill share, surging knowledge management. I think one of the challenges that Kim highlighted that's an impediment to effective networks for humanitarian response is this need for rapid response, this need for rapid decisiveness that networks are seen to be perhaps not so able to deliver. But can networks facilitate their members to be more decisive, more rapid in their response? It's not their network per se that needs to do it, but can it help do that for its members? And I think that's an interesting question. How do networks enable their members to be the best they can be? And something that I would like to be exploring also, as well as questions of trust, are around sort of healthy tensions. Where, I think I wrote down at one stage, networks look different and respond differently in different contexts, and depending on the individuals involved, I think. Where does freedom and diversity within networks kind of meet structure and formality and the need to deliver against in a particular way, but also to be able to respond and innovate? And how do networks share risk in terms of innovation? I think is something quite interesting, and something that came out in our report as well, that the partnership approach, if you see it even in a sort of slightly older bilateral way, is a way to share risk for local and national actors. It should also be a way to share reward and share recognition. How can networks do that for their members, and can they do it better than perhaps a bilateral model? I think arguably they can, but there's power dynamics at play in that. I was asked, how can networks be engaged with and supported? And I think very clearly something that comes out is around the funding and financing of networks. Not in terms necessarily of quantity. There's a real risk in terms of huge amounts of funding in very short time frames. We know that with the humanitarian response system in any case. But transparent, accountable, regular, predictable financing, financing that recognises not only the capacity and I suppose costs of networking, of doing networks, of managing and facilitating networks, but also the costs and time implications for staff of members to be part of and effectively contributing to networks. I think the networks that I've interacted with and been involved in, it's very clear that individuals and their ability to unselfishly and often essentially funded by the agency funding their role are benefiting the wider members very greatly and often disproportionately, but based on trust and understanding and appreciation, all these kind of perhaps less quantifiable qualities of networks, and yet often those things are what are driving and enabling innovation, knowledge sharing, and various other aspects. I suppose I'll leave a bit more. I think the funding and financing question and getting donors involved and engaged in that is going to be really important and key, because I think that's what needs to really deliver to kind of move forward in an effective way and not in a drowning, swamping way. I think an interesting perhaps point to say there is that I think there's power in numbers, and I think networks, and particularly, it'd be interesting to see in terms of NOAPAD or elsewhere. But we've seen in the past how national and local actors can somehow be at the mercy of donor requirements and international NGO requirements and everybody else's requirements. But actually, if networks came together and place their own conditions and kind of managed up, how much more power would they have to control the requirements that are being put on them, the conditions, and how would that dynamic work? And has it worked in certain areas? That I know with Christian Aid, perhaps more informally than formally, when partners come together for a heart-to-heart frank chat about how we're doing a piece of work, then they can be quite honest and frank, and it's, they have a lot more power doing that, being honest and frank together in a big room, than they do individually, and that has to be taken notice of. So, there's no doubt that dynamic can play out at a higher level, and I think arguably that has to be something that is facilitated to enable some of the real reorientation of the humanitarian system and the humanitarian financing to happen. Maybe I'll just leave it there for now. I've got various other points to say, but I think we can bring those out in the response. I hope that gives you a little bit to play with anyway.
Okay, it's a little bit like dropping a max into a box of fireworks, isn't it? So it's some really, really interesting and exciting ideas there. I think I love this idea about working as if local capacity mattered, and the challenge inherent in that phrase, and sort of what does that mean in a place where networks are almost a movement, the potential you're talking about here, Katherine, to sort of set the terms of engagement rather than to be purely sort of functional, but to be building the rules. And maybe that's one of the many things that we can talk about. Another idea that comes up there is the difficult balance for international actors between effective support and swamping. How, and this was something that came out quite strongly in the report, is how to best support these networks. And I don't know, Nigel, if that's one of the things that you might like to touch on now.